to ask you a few questions because you have an amazing bookstore in Florida, right? That's targeted
Yes, I do.
towards like romance books, right?
Correct.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you a few questions about what it's like managing a business like that. And could you start off telling me what it's like as a business owner for a store like that? Because I've never heard of something like that in California or any other state.
Yeah, so there's actually the first romance bookstore that ever existed started in California at the Rip the Bodice.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep. And it's the Rip Bodice. I think it opened in 2016, maybe. And they are over in Culver City, like outskirts of LA area. So that was the first romance bookstore to ever open up in the country. Um,
Okay.
since then, there's been a pretty big rise of romance bookstores kind of popping up. I think years following, it was very slow. We
Mhm.
were Florida's first uh, only romance only bookstore, so just very specific to the genre. But there's
Mhm.
about like 14 or 15 around the country now.
Really?
Yep.
Okay. And what is it like? Do most people who walk into your store, like customers, do they know what they're walking into, or do they think they're just walking into any regular bookstore?
Yeah, I think like 99% of the people who are coming to the store know that we are a romance only bookstore. But we
Mhm.
have gotten, especially if you look up like bookstores near me, right?
Mhm.
Are you kind of find the bookstore and then you might end up at the store. So we've gotten a few of those folks who are like, hey, do you sell Bibles in here? Do you sell used books?
Mhm.
Um, or they walk in and they quickly realize that like we're very genre specific. We have a very
Mhm.
small section in the back for books that are not within the romance genre, but for the
Mhm.
most part, it's all romance.
Okay. And why do you think it's important to create a space for only romance stories?
So I think specifically at our store, we try to focus a lot on authors and stories that have been underrepresented in media, right?
Mhm.
And especially for me, I am a immigrant from Peru, and so I feel like a lot of our stories of immigration have to do with like the hardship and what we've overcome. And obviously, those stories are very important, but I think that there's something really powerful in being able to see yourself and your identity laughing and in love and deserving of all of the good things that for the longest time, at least in America, right, we're primarily when you're watching a rom-com, you were primarily seeing two white main characters falling in love. You
Mhm.
weren't seeing yourself represented in that. But
Mhm.
I think too, just in general, like the human experience, right? I feel like falling in love and there's so much more than falling in love in these stories, right? Like there's protagonists who are finding themselves or who are overcoming some kind of trauma or learning to
Mhm.
communicate better or have gone through a divorce and like very real life things. And I feel like we can all relate to overcoming and finding our happily ever after because I feel like as a people, right, like we all just want to be loved at the end of the day, and that's why I think romance is so important.
Yeah, and I can definitely agree with that because I'm Muslim and I live in Dubai, and
Hmm.
I I've never come across like a romance book about like a Muslim girl, or like what I see in media is like, did you know the show Elite by any chance?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so like the Muslim girl in that show literally takes her hijab off for a man. So it's
Yeah.
like
Right.
she literally like loses a piece of her identity for romance. So like
Right.
I feel like
And if it was a book written by someone within the identity, right? Like that would have
mhm,
not never, but like 99% chance that they understand that the hijab is part of their identity and it's part of their freedom, it's part of what they choose, and they would have never given that up. Instead, they would have probably written or a main male character who empowers her in that, right?
Hmm. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think there's so many negative tropes that come out of romance books, like what we just talked about?
I don't know if those are tropes, but I think that there's a lot of obviously people can write what they want, right? But I feel like
Hmm.
all too often, people who are typically white are folks who are writing stories that maybe don't belong to them, right? And so if you're going to write outside of your lived experience, I think it's so important for you to do your proper research, do interviews, right?
Hmm.
Talk to the people within that identity to make sure. And obviously, even if you talk to 10 people, any identity is not a monolith. So
Hmm.
people's experiences can be different from that. But I think it's so important that people who are writing outside of their own lived experience really do the research so that you are not right stereotyping, you are not writing characters where that can be where your story can be hurtful to any community.
Okay. And what I was gonna ask you, what do you hope to tell, for example, what do you hope to tell girls who don't see themselves being reflected when reading or watching something in the media or reading a book?
um I feel like often people tell us like, well, like write or do the change you want to see, right? Or make the change you want to see. And obviously it's a lot easier said than done. But I would
Mhm.
say search for the stories because they're definitely out there. And you have to be intentional about it, right? Like I feel like when I first started like on my really heavy like journey of reading,
Mhm.
I was kind of just picking up, whatever was at the store's front. Here we have Barnes and Nobles, so like you'd walk into more Barnes and Nobles and just like whatever was marketed there without putting any intentionality behind the stories I was reading or researching even who was writing them. So I think start there, like before you pick up a bestseller, maybe figure out who is
Search
writing it
deeper.
and see if there's maybe somebody out there who is a part of your identity who's writing the same genre, right? And they're out there. I think I had to look for not for a long time, but I had to be intentional about what I was looking for. And as soon as I did, I
Mhm.
started finding all these stories written by black and brown people that I could relate to.
Mhm. And do you know the book, The Kiss Quotient?
I do.
And I was gonna ask you, what do you think, like, I'm actually not sure if the author has autism or anything, but do you think, like, in my opinion, I think that book represents autism in a better light compared to, like, other shows and books that I've read. So I was gonna ask you, do you think there's, like, a lot of books available like The Kiss Quotient that represent, like, mental disorders in the same light?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like Talia Hiver is a great author who writes um, neurodivergent stories in the same light. She's a black woman. She
Mhm.
lives in the UK, I believe, and I would say in the same vein as Helena Hong. And yeah, I think Helena does. I'm not sure what she identifies as, but um, I think that her books, if she is not within the identity, right, like definitely
Mhm.
went through a lot of research for her to be able to write that those books
About
in
this topic.
such in such a meaningful manner, and I think that that's so important.
And I wanted to ask you, um, how do you see your business making an impact on, like, the South Florida community, the Southern Florida community?
Yeah, so South Florida has, or just Florida in general, has a lot of really um, messed up policies that I guess are coming through like our governor, and I
Mhm,
think that it, there's like all the bans of all of these books that are, at the end of the day, just representing identities that have been underrepresented for so long, right? And
mhm,
I think that the bookstore aims to really create a safe space where people can be exactly who they are without
mhm,
um, without any repercussion. And I remember when we first opened, I had a person come up to me and tell me like, that they're working on moving out of Florida because of all of the policies against queer people, but that
mhm.
the store was one of the spaces that they felt the safest in. And I hope that that always continues to be what it is.
Okay, and then final question, I just wanted to ask you, what is your favorite romance book of all time?
Oh, my favorite romance book is Long Shot by Kennedy Ryan. It is a basketball romance, but it's a lot more than that. It really talks heavily about domestic violence and overcoming it as a woman and how you come out on the other side. And Kennedy did so many interviews with survivors of domestic violence and people
Mhm,
within that expertise to really create a story that's so beautiful and so empowering. Definitely a lot of trigger warnings, but it's a beautiful love story.